여기 그 파란 녹색 부분 와 있다.
Okay, welcome. Today is Tuesday, June 27th, 2023. I'm Danny Park, Treasurer of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. Okay, a little better. Thank you for joining us. We welcome friends and members who are attending here in person and those joining us on Zoom. I express RAS Korea's sincere gratitude to the Asia Development Foundation for its continued financial support. And we also thank COAT for partnering with us to provide a venue for our lectures. We encourage all of you to patronize the Joseon Salon at the Walkway Junction where you came in. Your patronage helps COAT continue to support our work. And you're cordially reminded that lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of the Royal Asiatic Society Korea. Tonight, we're joined by Robert Fouser, who holds a BA in Japanese Language and Literature and an MA in Applied Linguistics, both from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in Linguistics from Trinity College, Dublin. He studied Korean language at Seoul National University in the 1980s. He lived in Japan from 1995 to 2008, where he taught foreign language education at Kyoto University and developed a Korean language program at Kagoshima University. From 2008 to 2014, he taught Korean as a second foreign language at Seoul National University. He is currently an independent scholar based in Providence, Rhode Island. He is the author of 5 books in Korean, including 외국어 전파담, or The Spread of Foreign Languages in 2018, 로버트 파우저의 도시 탐구기, or Exploring Cities with Robert Fouser in 2019, and 외국어 학습담, or Thoughts on Learning Foreign Languages in 2021. He is currently finishing a book on the history of historic preservations in cities around the world, which will be published in the winter of 2023. He also is a translator of Understanding Korean Literature in 1997 by Kim Heung-gyu, and a co-author of Hanok, the Korean House in 2015. He writes regular columns for various media outlets in Korea. And without further ado, let's give Dr. Fouser a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. So I'll wear this, and then this might be another mic. So thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Is there, Matt, is there a thing to move the slides up and down, or should I just tell you? Okay. So welcome to my talk, and I'm actually very happy to see so many people here. This is sort of a strange talk for me because it's work in progress more than something that I've completed. I'm sort of sharing some insight on a work in progress, meaning that I'm still studying about this topic, and it's a very, very interesting topic, but also very hard to get a handle on how to, how to get a handle on the various phenomenon involved in language use. So the topic is language use in foreign migrant neighborhoods in Korean cities. And Korean cities is an important word because I'm not talking about rural areas where there may be people from Vietnam who are married to Korean man, or that kind of situation where I'm not talking about that because I didn't do any research there. That may be another situation. So I'm only talking about migrant communities in cities. Next slide, please. And so what I'll talk about today is migrant language, how migrant language influences language change from a broad perspective. And then I'll talk about migrant language offers insights into so why are we studying migrant language? First is it influences language change. Second is it offers insights into second language acquisition, which is what I wrote my PhD on. So in other words, by studying how migrants learn language, you can get an insight into how people learn language even in school or in various different situations. And migrant language reflects social and individual attitudes toward language. So it's rather interesting because when I first came to Korea in the 1980s, everywhere I would go, people would say something about my pronunciation. Either they would praise me, which I felt pleased by, or they would not understand something that was a little bit different. And there would be this game of repeating, and I would get nervous, and then it would decline from downhill, So anyway, there were a lot of comments about my pronunciation in the 1980s and 1990s. Now there's far less. And so that kind of social attitude change in Korea, how migrant language also reflects different changes in social attitudes by the native speakers or the people who have already lived here and learned the language. So that's an interesting thing. But I'm going to start with something that is anybody from Rhode Island? Nobody's ever from Rhode Island. I'm the only person. I'm a Michigander by birth, but that's, So if you go to do a restaurant and in Rhode Island, the waiter is above 50 years old, particularly outside the cool area of Providence, if you go to a suburban restaurant, somebody might say to you, what can I get for yous today? Now, why do they say yous? Well, very simple, because Italian immigrants they were the big Quebec immigrants first, and then a wave of Italian immigrants who didn't speak English. They came to Rhode Island and Boston and that area, and they very quickly came to the conclusion, houses, cars, well, not in the 19th century, but houses. And they decided that plural is made in English by adding S. So if I point to one person, if I say John, and then there's two people, it's very easy to conceive that, okay, one U is a U, and if you want to talk about two U's, you simply add an S. So this kind of, it's from Irish English too? Oh, okay. Yeah, so, this kind of, it reflects a lot of, the immigrants in Rhode Island, and as you say, Ireland, and there was a large Irish population in Rhode Island. So this is almost sort of standard English in Rhode Island for anybody over the age of 50. Young people, it's changed. Then the other thing in Rhode Island recently, there are 3 large groups, Dominicans from the Dominican Republic, and Cape Verdeans and Guatemalans, and all of people, and these are the large immigrant communities in Rhode Island today, and they often have a lot of code switching. So I've asked quite a few Dominican people that I know, various different types of jobs, and a lot of them speak English, sort of standard English, outside world English for their work, Spanish, and then a kind of Spanglish in their communities. And Spanglish is a mix of Spanish and English. And so you'll get 3 languages kind of going on. Cape Verdeans are an interesting group because they will speak English to the outside world, and in the inside world, and with other people from Portugal and Brazil, they will switch from Portuguese to Cape Verdean Creole, and you have a mixing going on depending who you're talking to. And then the Guatemalan community is interesting because many of the people from that community speak a Mayan language. There are many different languages, so that is, they'll speak Spanish, English, and Mayan language. So you have a lot of mixing going on, and that is an interesting story with migrant language. So what does that mixing reflect about society? And then how do people, the process of learning a language, what does that say about language learning in general? So next slide, please. Migrants in Korea. This is very hard to define, like what is a migrant? When I lived here, was I a migrant? Probably yes. Since I don't live here anymore, I'm no longer a migrant maybe, but migrant is a very hard thing to define for a lot of people, but it means people moving from one country to another and living there. The largest, this is by nationality. So the largest group of migrants in Korea is Chinese nationality. Many of them are ethnic Korean, okay? But they're still not Korean passports. They have a Chinese passport, but they're ethnic Korean. So by far the largest group is Chinese, Then the next then you have Vietnamese, a lot of Thai, United States, and of course that would include Korean Americans who have a US passport. So it's hard, this is based on nationality, not ethnicity. So you can see that people come from all over the world, but the biggest group is China, and then Thailand, Vietnam, United States, Uzbekistan is in there, Kazakhstan, the former parts of the Soviet Union, which still a lot of them speak Russian. So the next slide. And then we have this was rather interesting. Where do people live? And Korea's quite interesting in that a lot of the migrants actually don't live in the biggest cities. So it's different from other countries where you have, say, New York traditionally was the gateway to the US, then that switched maybe to Los Angeles, Miami. In terms of numbers, New York would still be number one, but Los Angeles, Miami, percentage-wise is higher. So Korea, Gyeonggi-do is the highest number of foreign migrants by quite higher, much higher than Seoul. And this is very different from the 1980s and 1990s when I first came to Korea, because if you left Seoul, there would be very, very few foreigners. So the migration in Korea has moved from big cities like Seoul or Busan into the countryside, different areas across the country. And you can see that Gyeonggi-do is probably, if these trends continue, it may be double the number of foreigners than Seoul in a few years. So Gyeonggi, it's the most, it has the largest population, but the number of foreigners is by far concentrated mostly in Gyeonggi-do. And then on the right, you see an interesting figure where the peak so far, right? So far, the peak in the foreign population was in 2019 before the pandemic. And after the pandemic, the number of the foreign population has started to decline. A lot of that would be students, but some of it would be migrant workers, and an interesting phenomenon, which I'll talk about at the end. But the population of foreigners has started to decline after increasing quite rapidly. And then at the bottom here, you see the different types of foreigners, okay, classified according to citizenship and things like that. So we have students, and in the pink red area, these are foreigners who have foreign citizenship and come here for a specific purpose. In yellow, it's people classified as foreigners who were born to Koreans, people born to foreigners in Korea. And then the next one is 21% in green is foreigners who have taken a Korean passport, okay? So the number of foreigners who live here who have become Korean citizens, meaning they're really not any longer foreigners, is only about 21%. So that would be an interesting thing to compare with other countries. So you have, different classifications, and all of these classifications are this is according to the government, because the government produced the statistics that went into Yonhap News to produce this report. But how foreigners are classified and the classifications and what they mean is also a rather sort of improvised or artificial way of doing so, depending on the type of policy that's being implemented. So those classifications are important for studying the use of migrant language. Okay, and you can see right at the bottom here, again, the increase, steady increase all the way until 2019, the pandemic, and it's gone down. Okay, the next slide, please. And then this is the migrant population, foreign population in each province, but also by the country of origin. So you have Seoul, yellow is ethnic Chinese ethnic Koreans from China. And so Seoul has a large population of that. But if you look at the bottom and you have Gyeongsangnam-do there, you see that population is less. Gyeongsangnam-do, purple, I think, is Vietnam, maybe, or you have different countries. But the distribution of foreigners by country of origin is not uniform across the country. And that's one thing that I found in doing this research, that some places have a much higher percentage of, say, ethnic Koreans from China, and other places are more diverse and have, people from Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, mostly Southeast Asia, but you'll get other places as well. So, and the darker areas have a higher percentage of foreigners as a percentage of the total population. It's not the number of foreigners, but it's the density, the percentage. So you can see that around Seoul in Gyeonggi province, these areas have the highest density of migrant population, but also down in Jeollado, Yeongam, which is near Mokpo. That's a place I would like to go to. I haven't had a chance. That has a lot of foreigners who work in factories. Gimhae, which we'll talk about, is over near Busan. So you can see next Daegu to the west of Daegu is an area with a lot of factories where there's a lot of migrant workers. So these areas have, for more density of foreign population. Okay, next slide. And then foreign migrant communities in Korea. I visited 3. I visited many others, but these 3 I sort of visited with a point of view of trying to find out what language was being used and how that was working. Ansan, infrequent visits, meaning infrequent, like every 2 years, every 3 years, something like that. Uh-oh, we got it back. Yeah. Okay. It's not Windows 2010, right? No. I'm just joking, because I gave a presentation where somebody was using PowerPoint 2010, and I felt like I was nostalgia. So I did, every 2 or 3 years I would go to Ansan. Gimhae, I was a visit in 2022, and I stayed there 3 or 4 days. And then Daerim-dong, I visited off and on from various different times over the last, say, 5 years. Other places I visited, Dongdaemun, Changsingdong, this actually had migrants coming quite early, the late 1990s, and they increased. And then recently that population has gone down, moved to other places. So that area has changed a bit. Other places in Seoul, and then Incheon, Myanmar town. I went there with Matt last year. And Hanbak Maol, which is also in Incheon, and I went there this year by myself. It's mostly former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Of the 2, Uzbekistan is more, and places like that. So these are places I visited. So there are many other places I could go, but these are kind of cities. That's what I was focusing on, because countryside is something different. So I wanted the common sort of thread running through this is these are cities with a commercial area. Ansan, Gimhae, and Daerim-dong. Yes?
Are you distinguishing the difference between migrant communities from immigrant communities?
They're both the same thing to me in this talk. Yeah. Immigrant is
People who are for the time being
permanent. Yeah. And so I'm treating them the same in this talk from the language point of view, but there is a difference. The thing with immigrants is Korea has the process of naturalization and things is a bit difficult. So if I wanted to do the countryside where you have the women who have married Korean men and then become Korean citizens, that's where the immigration thing would be stronger. You should be thinking that, because I want to leave that question, with you. So you're doing a good job. You're a good student. Okay. Next slide, please. All right. So this is, again, the same thing about the density, but this gives a little bit more detail. The percent, it says 외국인. So again, that's everybody, right? Immigrants or migrants or whatever. And it's the percentage over 5%. Now, anybody from Canada, Toronto, Canada here? Okay. What do you know the percentage?
not correct.
I think it's about 45. Yeah. And I think Miami in the US is about 38. New York City is about 33. LA is quite, up there. So, any of these big cities in North America, you're going to get into the 30s, the percentage of people who have, who were born overseas. A lot of European cities will have the same thing. I think Brussels is maybe half or more. So, the 5% by world standards is actually a very low level.
49.
49, okay. So yeah, I knew Toronto was the most in North America. Maybe Miami's competition for it, but yeah.
Exclude the US military?
They exclude the US military because these figures, this is the 행정 행정자치부. So these are all government figures. So they would include anybody who has a 외국인 등록증.
And SOFA people do not have weight.
And SOFA people do not have that. They're always a separate group. Right.
Yeah.
And I don't count either because I'm here on a 90-day, visa, not visa, but 90-day. So it's people with a 외국인 등록증. So everybody, that's pretty easy to understand for most people in this audience. So again, you can look at these numbers. So the SOFA people are not counted because they don't have that. Pocheon, which would be an interesting place to go to, is approaching 10%, right? And all of these. Where I went to, Ansan is 11, so that is the highest of the places listed here. Siheung, also quite high. But again, by world standards, this is not extremely high. If you look at Korean tradition, however, Korean history, the whole length of Korean history, this is actually a very high percentage. So that's just a map of where I went, Daerim-dong, Ansan, and then Gimhae. Next slide, please.
Why does Buja Island?
It has a lot of factories. Yeah, shipbuilding, yeah. It's always had a lot of factories since the Korean War. So, 군내 등록 외국인 주요 국가별 현황. So you have by nationality, and again, this is Chinese would include a lot of ethnic Koreans. And then you have, the next would be Vietnam, Uzbekistan, Philippines, Cambodia, Nepal. This, of course, is foreign workers. So this is people who have a worker's visa, right? Not a professor's visa, not a student visa. So all of this is the percentage by nationality of foreign workers, okay? And so this is, you can see these, it's China, Vietnam, and on through. Africa is 1%. So there's a very small percentage of the foreign worker population that is from Africa. So it's not just from Asia, but mostly from other Asian countries. So this would indicate that if you have a factory town and you have migrant workers living nearby, then these populations would be more represented. Okay, next slide. So the Ansan situation, has anybody been to Ansan? Yeah, okay, right. So it's kind of a popular place kind of interesting place to visit. Again, if you look on the right from 2021, there's the Chinese population is by far the highest. Then you have next is Uzbekistan, Russia, Kazakhstan. And this is interesting linguistically because, as I'll tell you later, this means Russian is a lingua franca in this community. Among people who understand Russian, they may speak Kazakh, they may speak Uzbek to each other with their friends, but if they're speaking to another person who's from the former Soviet Union, the CIS country, then they would be using Russian as a bridge language. So Russian is quite a common lingua franca in these areas. And then we have on down. And this is a map just of the area, which is in front of the Ansan station. And there's this foreign, foreign migrant community shopping street and this kind of place where a lot of people go for their daily needs. Okay, next slide. So that's where I walked around and listened to people and that kind of thing. So this is just an example of the mixing of the languages. Matt, can you go back a few slides? Keep going back. I think we missed something. No, okay, keep going forward. Okay, yeah. Okay, so you can see the different mix of the languages, and of course, Dream Telecom, that's English. So also not just Russian, but English is also an important lingua franca, of course, as is Korean, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the next slide. And again, a lot of, because the Chinese population, for people who speak Chinese, from ethnic Koreans from China, this is the largest population. Most of the signs, a lot of Chinese that you hear, but then there are shops that cater to people with different languages. And that, you know, you can see Vietnamese and all kinds of other languages as well. Okay, next slide. And Ansan is very interesting because they have this wonderful place. If you visit Ansan, make sure to check out the Ansan Gamunwa Jagun Toso관, which isn't so small, actually, but it's a wonderful library in the basement of the community center, which is in that neighborhood. The city government runs a community center, and it has all kinds of services for foreigners. There's even the Ministry of, you know, the Justice Ministry has a 출입국 관리소, alien, where you can do your alien registration stuff, and there's health centers and education, and kind of a combined place with different government services. So this is in the basement, and there are about, I think she's told me about 21 languages represented. So you have 21 languages. Most, again, would be the biggest demand is Chinese. Somebody get their phone. Yeah. The biggest demand is Chinese language, and then you have Russian, which of course people from Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, they would be able to read Russian. So but there are 21 languages represented here. So this is an interesting case where the government, the local government, is paying, and they built this building and they're offering these services to people in the foreign community. Okay, next. These are pictures from 2009, taken by an antique digital camera that I think I gave to my niece, who thinks they're cool. But anyway, this is, you have quite similar mix of people in the community, and some communities have quite a bit of change. I mentioned Dongdaemun in the Changshin-dong area. That had a lot of Vietnamese people in the early 2000s, a lot of people from Nepal, and it's kind of changed a bit. So, there is movement and change in the population over time. This seems to have stayed quite steady with the Chinese population, Chinese-speaking population being most dominant. Okay, next slide. And then we have Gimhae. And Gimhae is, you have many fewer people. Population is only 4,000 some foreigners, but you have the largest contingent comes from Indonesia, and then we have Indonesia, and then Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Philippines. So you have quite a diverse population in Gimhae. The number of Chinese speakers of Chinese, ethnic Chinese from Korea or Chinese from China is much less here. So that this is an interesting community where the Chinese language influence is less. Okay, next slide. And this is, again, a very similar thing to Ansan. You have in part of Gimhae is a very large city geographically. So if you go to the airport and try to look for this community, it's a bit hard to find. And parts of Gimhae are a bed town for Busan and things like that. But this part is the old downtown of Gimhae before it became a big suburb of Busan. So it's a kind of a little bit isolated and from a little bit isolated. But anyway, this has a large number of different shops and things for foreigners. So I walked around here. And next slide, please. And Vietnamese on the right would be, I think that's Cambodian. So you have a lot of signs for Southeast Asian, again, representing the population that's there. And next slide, please. Oops. Yeah, that one. Okay. And you have a Uzbekistan restaurant, a lot of people from that Central Asia, those Central Asian countries. And one interesting thing about Gimhae is, unlike Ansan, where I couldn't really find a large open market near where this community was, the old market in Gimhae, a lot of foreign merchants have moved in and are kind of bringing the market back to life. So a lot of the people in the market are selling. The market now has a lot of shops run by migrant migrant people from different places. Okay. Next is Daerim-dong, and this is, has anybody been to Daerim-dong? Okay, good, yeah, all right. You guys are brave, because sometimes when you say Daerim-dong, Korean friends will say there's a lot of crime there. I say, I'm from the United States. So, you know, danger being associated with a migrant area is a common problem. We're dealing with prejudice, but so that this area has that image. There's a large shopping street, and again, the large shopping street is mostly Chinese shops, and most of the population in Daerim-dong is ethnic Koreans from China. So very, not more so than Chinese from China, who are the largest group of people, non-ethnic Koreans from China are foreign students, and they kind of usually live near the university where they study, or in different, you know, they're kind of more spread out rather than living in a concentrated area like this. Okay, the next slide. And again, you can see heavy Chinese influence, and, you know, a lot of the signs are Chinese, etc. And the next slide. And these were Ajumonis dancing in a park. It kind of reminded me my image of what North Korea might look like, you know, that kind of thing. But so the community has appropriated public space for its own activities, which of course is a common thing with migration. And the next slide, please. So sociolinguistic perspectives on language use in migrant communities. So there are 4 things I was looking at. One is the use of Korean. Next is the use of native languages. Okay, and some of that, I don't understand all of them, so I can't really, you know, make a, but I know it's not Korean or English or another language. And then we have use of English and other lingua francas. And the concept of a lingua franca is very important, because that that's the language used in the community and is a bridge between people. And so that also is important. Which language is the main lingua franca tells you a lot about the character of the community. And then languages in official commercial signage. So what languages are used in official and commercial signage? And this is actually a very important thing, because it tells you something about what the government authorities and people in power, what they think about language and how to communicate with people in a community. So next slide, please. And the research method is observation based on walks, visits to local businesses. I didn't interview people because I didn't want to. And you're going to say, well, your speaker's lazy. That's another issue. I'm not really lazy. I didn't want to interview people because I didn't want to run around and take up people's time and be the sort of foreigner running around trying to extract and use people. I wanted to kind of be cool and remote and distant. And I didn't want to get involved in the problem of trying to be an anthropologist. In other words, I'm not trained as an anthropologist. I'm a linguist, and you know, I did a lot of sociolinguistics. So sociolinguistics, rather than focusing on individuals and their personal characteristics and how that influences things, sociolinguistics is more interested in large groups. So how do large groups approach language use? So I was more interested in groups rather than individuals. And I wrote down notes about what I heard. I didn't write down a lot of details. I didn't say, oh, 50-year-old ajoshi in phone shop said something. I didn't even write that down. I just wrote down what I heard. And I really didn't care the age or the details, because what I wanted was a snapshot, not to go in and disturb the community. I wanted to keep this real chill outsider distance. Somebody who kind of, you know, a very famous book in a very famous publication in the history of sociolinguistics is The Social Stratification of English in New York City by William Labov. And he's now in his late 80s, 90s. He sort of pioneered the field of sociolinguistics in the 1960s. he did a similar research method in department stores in New York. And so he found that the parts of the department store that sold more expensive goods had a different way of speaking than parts of department stores that sold cheaper goods, because they were trying to reach different communities. And he would focus on things like the dropping of the R, different, sociolinguistic phenomena in New York City. So I kind of mimicked Labov, but not in, I wasn't doing this for a PhD. Labov did it for his PhD, but I wanted that to listen and take notes about what I hear, but not go into the details of personal matters. Okay, so that could be a limitation. If you're an anthropologist, you're going to say, ugh, this is, but if you're not, then, that's what I wanted to do, because I didn't live there. I don't live there. I'm not a part of that community. I didn't want to be an invader. That was one thing that was on my mind. Okay, next slide. And so use of Korean. Well, what do we get with use of Korean? And again, this is not like interviewing 1,000 people. It's walking around several days in different places and then following up. Most migrant language or language learning involves some simplification. So you have short sentences and content words. That's an obvious thing. But this is a very common pattern of communication in Korean between native speakers and migrants, or migrants amongst themselves. So you have the simplification, it's meaning short sentences and content words. And that's an obvious one. The one that's a little less obvious that I thought was surprising was the use of one speech level. And usually that was panmal. Okay, so why would panmal be to me, panmal is almost like violence. If somebody, unless the person is like 95 years old, mogaba, I would feel very happy that she thinks I'm so young, he or she thinks I'm so young. But, if it's not somebody who's really like a grandfather, 할아버지, 할머니, and uses panmal, I will think, I could get quite angry or feel quite unpleasant. That's not what's going on in these communities. It's a simplification. So moving towards using one language level, speech level. And what is a speech level? In sociolinguistics, a speech level is a level of curating your talking to fit your audience. So people do this all the time, right? But say in English, the F word is part of a speech level that I'm not going to use with you guys right now. But when we're drinking, right, Matt? When we're drinking, I don't know. You switch speech levels. So people have the ability to switch speech levels. You can be very formal and then more formal, but chummy and polite, and then you can be very intimate. So this is in all languages. In Korean, however, speech levels are linguistically marked, okay? And linguistic marking means they're reflected in the grammar. The verb ending is different, 했습니다 is a different verb ending from 했어요, from 했어, 했다, right? They're different verb endings. So there's a grammatical notation that, will indicate the speech level. English doesn't have that. So English, you use tone of voice. So if you've ever had an argument with somebody and they look at you and somebody will say, don't look at me in that tone of voice, right? That English has tone of voice. I have a friend from the South who said, bless your heart is the most passive aggressive saying in the American Southern dialect. Bless your heart, right? So you can have it. It's all languages have speech levels. In Korean, the why panmal, most likely because in migrant communities, that's the first speech level that people learn. So if we've learned Korean, if people in this room who've learned Korean learned it in school, you're not learning panmal first. Usually you will learn heyoche or 합쇼che, 씁니다, heyo, 씁니다, heyo. You don't learn he on the first day of Korean class. You don't say 선생님 공부해, right? You don't do that. That's a strange, So you would learn a more formal form in school. But migrants are working in a factory and they're learning Korean, in the street. And so the panmal is often the first level that speech level that people are comfortable with. So you have this going on. And that kind of surprised me because it's kind of interesting to hear a lot of panmal, but nobody was really angry. It was panmal as the convenient choice, right? Okay, and then proficiency level, the accommodation to native speaker norms, okay? What does that mean? Accommodation to native speaker norms means trying to sound like a native speaker, which you don't have to do, right? You don't have to do it, but people, as proficiency increases, that people naturally start to sound more or adopt more native speaker norms. So then you would get perhaps more speech levels, more manipulation of the language going on with higher levels of proficiency. Another interesting thing is the range of proficiency. So more proficient speakers dominate interaction with with people from a different language background. So if you have a shop and there are two people from Uzbekistan, for example, one doesn't speak Korean very well, the other does, that person who speaks Korean better becomes the interlocutor, the person who does all the talking with the outside community. That's a very common thing in migrant communities. Of course, in the United States, it's a common thing as well. You'll have one person who is sort of the contact person for the outside world and that kind of thing until other people develop their language. And Korean is the dominant lingua franca among speakers of different languages. So speakers of different languages don't use English, right? They will, but that Korean is more the dominant language. And that's because if you look at the population, except for people from South Asia and the Philippines, most of the people come from countries that don't have a strong tradition of having been colonized by an English-speaking country, or the English ability is not as high. So in that case, it's more natural perhaps for people to speak Korean as a lingua franca. Okay, next slide. And then speech levels in Korean, just to give you an overview. If you talk to a scholar of Korean language, they will say there are 5, but there really aren't, because they two of those speech levels have sort of fallen out of use, or rather 6. So there are really 4. So 2 have fallen out of use. The last time I heard one, it's the, hage, that sort of very formal thing that you might learn in Korean language class in school. The last time I heard that being spoken was by a colleague of mine at Seoul National University, who is now in his late 70s, but he occasionally would speak that way to students. And I kind of mimicked him a few times just for fun with my students, and they kind of laughed. So it's not a really common, it exists, and it will be in the movies and films and stuff like that. But as far as everyday Korean in the street, usually you hear 4 speech levels. And the deferential formal, that's the 씁니다, 갑니다. And that, of course, is used in news and TV and that kind of thing. It's also used in some dialects in Korean more than others. And say, I'm 61 years old, so this is comfortable for me because I don't want to run around trying to act like a hipster. So if I want to act like a 61-year-old ajushi, I use this form. It's comfortable for me. It keeps a distance, but it has a formality. Then there's the heyo, the heyo level, polite informal. And that is, the key to that is informality. Both deferential formal, you have the difference in formality. It's not one is impolite or the other. It's the level of formality. And then you have panmal, which is the intimate level. And then the plain is used for writing, okay, in text, maybe in the Korean military, but that's an experience I don't have. I used to know some Korean military officers who would use the plain form in speaking, and it was always kind of scary. But, it could be used in certain contexts, but mostly the plain form is used in writing. So you have 3 in speaking, but really, next slide, please. Really only 2. I mean, if you think of the The umnida, sumnida level is something that most people don't use a lot. And especially, if you're living in Seoul and younger, this kind of thing, you're really talking about 2 speech levels, okay, that are common for a lot of people. So that means that, what the migrant communities, this is still a difficult concept for, people who come to Korea and are busy working, I don't know, 12 hours a day or 10 hours a day or whatever, and they're learning Korean on the street. This concept is not easy to master. They don't have the benefit of having been taught this in school. So as their proficiency develops, this is something they will have to come to grips with as speakers of the language. Next. Okay, and so again, why Panmal? Well, I talked a little bit about that, but just to run through it. Native speakers think in Panmal. Most Koreans think in Panmal. Korean native speakers, anybody think in Sumnida, Umnida? Okay, what are you guys thinking? If you think in language, most Korean native speakers think in Panmal. Yeah, that's what I've been told. I'm not a native speaker, so I can't say. In my case, I think in Panmal. Even though I'm not, I don't live with a Korean, I still think in Panmal. So if something happens and I think in Korean, I will think, "안되지, 안돼." Where? That's what I will think in. I won't say that, but so I think in Panmal too. So that means if native speakers of Korean think in Panmal, that's what you use in your family, your house, with friends, etc. It's the easiest for native speakers of Korean to use too. So it's not just migrants, but also native speakers of Korean. Then non-native migrants who learn Korean in the workplace usually learn Panmal first. So Panmal is actually convenient for both. In other words, you don't really have to worry about anything. If I go to Starbucks right now, and what will they say to me? Starbucks입니다. And if I said something like, 그래? Espresso 두 잔 줘. They would think, wow, like he should be arrested, right? So you don't do that. So, but in a sense, Panmal gets rid of all that kind of dressing up the language. And it's a convenient thing if you think of a community of people where that is perhaps the most comfortable way of speaking. So it's a comfort issue, an ease and comfort and convenience. And then simplification of language, changes in terms of address. So I didn't hear a lot of, if you're speaking Panmal, what is the word for you? No, right? Is no a strong word? 당신's a fighting word unless you're married. What is no? I mean, yeah, if somebody I didn't know said to me no, it would be, kind of. So instead of that intimate, level or 형 or oppa or these intimate terms of address, it's more distant terms of address. They have more distant terms of address. So that is something where the certain terms of intimacy, those fall out of practice in the migrant communities simply because the people don't know each other, right? And so a lot of those terms of address fall out of use. And then use of impolite yo form increases with proficiency. So that would be somebody who keeps getting better and learning more Korean, and they're, say, working in a shop and they have Korean customers, and they start to learn that this is the way to, that they start to learn that commercial language that we would learn, that your common, that we hear a lot in shops and things like that. Okay, next slide. And use of native languages, and in communities with a dominant language group, obviously that language becomes the community language. So Daerim-dong, overwhelmingly Chinese. That's about all you hear. Other parts you hear different. So in more multilingual communities, native languages are more private. Say Vietnamese or Cambodian would be private among people from that community. But then you would have Korean, English, or another language as a lingua franca to connect people with each other in the community. And that mostly is Korean, but there is some English. And there is, again, as I said, Russian and maybe even perhaps Chinese or some other languages as well. I found no evidence of Koreans using migrants' native language, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. For example, there are universities or hospitals. One time I went to a hospital to get a checkup, and somebody who didn't look Korean, but came over to me and said in very good English, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes." And it turned out he was from Kazakhstan and had studied English, majored in English, and he was there to help people from Russia and the Russian-speaking world use the hospital. So there are plenty of cases where Korean institutions will hire somebody to speak the language, or you may have a Korean hired to interact, but I couldn't find any evidence of that in these areas. Okay, and next slide, please. And use of English and other lingua francas, again, just English is more common in multilingual communities with people, again, as I said before, from South Asia and the Philippines. Okay, next slide. And then signage is very interesting. And it's very interesting because I'll tell you a very quick story about a trip to Tokyo I had before the pandemic. I went to Tokyo and I was in Yanaka, which is a lovely neighborhood near where the museums are in Ueno Park. And I went into a park and I used the toilet, and the toilet had a sign telling me how to use the toilet. And it told me not to stand on the toilet, to sit. And I wondered, and I looked at the sign, and it was Japanese, English, and Chinese. But what was interesting is I know not to stand on the toilet. And so I later asked somebody about this, a Japanese professor friend, and he said that when they made those signs, the Tokyo city government was afraid of being accused of discrimination against Chinese. So they decided everything in Japanese and then English. And English will be the neutral language. And then things that are designed for a specific group would be put in that language. So it's kind of an interesting, you could say it's sensitive, it's being sensitive, but the choice of language is very interesting. So we have official signage usually contains almost always, not 100%, but Korean and one dominant language of the particular area. So you have Korean and one other language. Then, like the toilet I described in Japan, you have official information in other languages used. That's the bottom, sorry. You have official information in other languages used in the community is also common. And then you have multilingual signage is common with a mix of languages determined by the customer base. In other words, usually the government signs have fewer languages, whereas signs in shops and signs for commercial purposes have more languages that appeal to the customer base of that particular shop. And that's something that's kind of interesting. And official and commercial signage often includes English as a lingua franca. So again, like the thing I described about the toilet in Tokyo. Okay, next slide. And here's life in Ansan, and this is in multiple languages. And this is from Gimhae on the right. And you have Korean is always first. This is like what would be found in Japan or even in the US, Rhode Island, where I live, and then you have English, and then Chinese, and what? Vietnamese, and what's the bottom language? I think it might be Indonesian. I don't know. I didn't have time to struggle with the inputting. Huh? Tagalog. Okay, Tagalog. That would make sense with the community. So this is again, a government sign, but it has quite a few languages. Ansan creates this in quite a few languages. Next slide. And this is the center in Ansan that I mentioned, the Ansan City Community Center for the Foreign Community. And this is all in Korean, but you have English, Chinese. So again, the number of languages is more limited. And here on the right, this is from Ansan as well. and you have what? Korean, English, and no, this is Gimhae, sorry. This is on the right is Gimhae, and you have Korean, English, and Chinese, and I think Vietnamese. Yeah, so you get quite a few multilingual signs. Of course, the problem is who decides which language should be put there and why, right? So if the population changes, then you might have to redo the signs in theory, right? If you're doing it by numbers, then are you doing it by numbers? Are you doing it by problem? Deciding that perhaps this group needs more official information than another group? What are your criteria for choosing the language that you put in official information? In Rhode Island, and nobody lives in Rhode Island except for me. In Rhode Island, I have the Obamacare health insurance, okay? And every month I get a statement, and it has about 16 languages on the back telling you if you need more help, call this number. If you need more help, call this number. And I kind of look at it sometimes. It's the most interesting thing in the mail that day, usually. And I turn it over and I look and I can, try to figure out, but it's the languages of the community in Rhode Island. So you'll get, obviously, you get Spanish and Portuguese and Cape Verdean Creole and Laotian and Korean is represented, Chinese. It's a quite long list of languages. So again, the number of languages and the choice of languages is quite arbitrary, and it reflects what the government officials and they would think is important for the community to know. Okay, next slide.
Unidentified language is
Uzbek. Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, so Uzbek, yeah. It's interesting. And that they didn't do it in Russian is also quite interesting, because if they'd done it in Russian, most Uzbeks would be able to read it. So it might indicate that the Uzbek population is the younger Uzbeks who don't know as much Russian, say, as the previous generation. So that's, yeah, thank you for telling me. Okay, and then we have the other official information, and this is kind of another type of official information, but we have Hamunwa Umshik Kore, the multicultural food street, which sounds much better in Korean than English, but this is for tourists or outsiders. So outsiders have official information as well. It's aimed at outsiders, and this has Korean and English. And again, you get the same thing here on the right, where you have, this is only in Korean, and it's aimed not at the foreign community, but it's aimed more at Koreans. Or it could be aimed at both, but that if it were aimed at the migrant community, it would most likely include another language. So this is aimed for Koreans. And of course, on the left, what do we have? Homju Soshi Chunchio. What is that? About crime, right? So, the information about crime and, crime control efforts to improve the safety of the area, that information is given only in Korean. Okay. All right, next slide. And this one is also an interesting thing where religious groups are very active in these communities. And you have the Catholic migrant workers, but they have first, this is in Korean, and everything is in, Korean, English. And this is Gimhae, okay? So again, if you're not an English speaker and you want information of this, you're going to have to read Korean. So again, what does this say about the proficiency of Korean in this area? It's kind of interesting. And on the right is also Gimhae, and this is a advertisement or a notice for Arabic lessons at the local mosque. And so this is Arabic lessons at the local mosque, and that is offered, that information is available. So again, aimed mainly at outsiders, perhaps, Korean and English, that the information is given in Korean and English. So more aimed at outsiders, perhaps. That's something that I could follow up on, but these are interesting cases where perhaps the people involved are thinking more of, they might not know the languages of the neighborhood, or they are using English as a bridge language and Korean, trying to aim for a more outside community. Okay, next slide. And then you have instant sort of notes that are put up by the local shopkeepers, and these are all in another language with no Korean at all. So this is a common thing where you have, the languages, that language that's used between inside the local community, it doesn't relate to the outside community. So this, I think, is Cambodian. I think it's Cambodian, yeah. So the sign is obviously aimed for that community and nobody else. Next slide. And this restaurant, this is Sinhalese, because the reason I can tell that is because of the flag of Sri Lanka, but this is Sinhalese. And again, only in that language, so not aimed at tourists. If I walked in, I'm sure everybody would be happy to have a customer and it'd be okay, but they might be surprised, right? Or, again, it's aimed at that local community, except for the one sign on the right, Juchagumji, right? So, that's aimed for the broader community. So you have this interesting thing about who decides or thinks or suspects or expects certain people to read different signs. Okay, next one. And conclusion and future directions. How are we doing for time, sir? Good, okay. So conclusion and future directions. Okay, communities with one dominant, a community with one dominant language uses less Korean. So they become, in a sense, more isolated. So we've been through that. That's the one thing. Monolingual communities have a higher, with a higher percentage of Korean speakers. So Gimhae is not as large as Ansan. The Korean community is quite close to that area. There's a lot of more intermingling, and therefore Korean is the dominant language, but the community itself feels much more diverse. And then less intimate panmal, that means without the sort of friendly terms of address, without no, and oppa, and that kind of stuff. So the sort of a more distant panmal is common interaction between native and non-native speakers, and that reflects simplification. Increase in use of informal polite yo form as proficiency goes up. So that would mean then that as people begin to realize the difference, that they will be able to start to switch speech levels as native speakers do. And again, that's the process of learning a language. It may take a long time for some people. Some people may not be interested. That's another matter, but this is a part of that process that goes on. Okay, next slide. So whither foreign migrant population, and this is sort of a, nobody can predict the future, right? If we had had this lecture 4 years ago and I said a huge pandemic is coming, nobody would have, and all kinds of other things that have happened. But if you look at the left rather, the number of foreigners in Daerim-dong is going down quite sharply, okay? So Karibongdong is near the Kasan Digital Danji, all right? And that used to have a much larger foreign population until they did the redevelopment of that area. So again, redevelopment not only displaces Koreans, it also displaces the foreign community. But that's the only thing I'll say about redevelopment today. So you have this declining population. And actually, a couple weeks ago, I had an interesting discussion with an architect friend. And she told me that, a lot of the construction in Korea depends on foreign workers. And it's really hard to get people to do any construction work because foreigners aren't coming to Korea as much as they used to. And then somebody said, who was with us, it was a group, said, how about Chosunjok? How about ethnic Koreans from China? And she said, they're not coming. And, she looked at me, why do you think that? And I don't know, I hadn't, it's an interesting phenomenon that the population, the number of ethnic Koreans in China is going down. Ethnic Chinese in Korea is going down. And again, if you look at the right, this says the increase in the number of migrants or immigrants, migrants, whatever, however you want to define that, among the OECD countries, which is 38 countries. Most of them are rich, not all of them. And you see Canada, by far the highest increase. So Canada last year, 2022, I think recorded 1 million immigrants for the first time in its history. Next is England, UK, and the United States. This would be from 2021. So after recovering from COVID, the US had a large number of immigrants. And the average for the OECD, and then Korea and Japan are below. but the policies have not necessarily changed. In other words, there's no anti-foreign policy in Korea, you know, kick the foreigners out, or in Japan, nothing has changed in that respect. Something else is going on. Okay, so next slide. So if you look at migration trends, this is from 2016. You have plus countries and minus countries, and the plus countries are in blue. Korea is a plus country. The minus countries are in orange, and then sort of balanced migration between the number of people leaving and going is the countries in green, and you know, or where there may be little movement at all, like North Korea. So again, what is interesting is that as many countries in the world start to have aging populations, not just Italy or Japan or Korea, but a lot of the European countries, but also places, say, as we get to 2050, which is only 27 years later, you know, that's not a long time. 2050 is coming up in 27 years. Places like Brazil, Argentina, a lot of, you know, obviously China, but Mexico will start to reach their peak. And, you know, a lot of countries will start to reach their peak population and have an aging population, and they may be competing for workers. They may be competing for migrants. So that's perhaps what might be going on with migration in Korea, is that Korea's no longer an appealing place to come to. In other words, if you're a tech worker, right, or if you're a worker, where would you rather go, Korea or Canada? And I'm not talking about the snow or the weather. Sorry, Canadians. I'm talking about, you know, as a place where you can go and become a citizen and put down roots and raise your family and this kind of thing. The idea of putting down roots, I think that's maybe what's going on, and that's the last slide. So questions for the future: amid increased competition, will Korea continue to be attractive to migrants? So the paradigm that developed in the 1980s, 1990s, mostly in the 1990s and the 2000s, this paradigm of these 3-year work visas with extensions, and the money is much better than Nepal or Sri Lanka and that kind of thing. That may have worked at that time, but it might no longer work in the future. That's just an idea. I'm not saying I agree. I'm arguing that. I'm just leaving that as a question for you. So migrant community sustainability. In other words, what we're talking about today could fade away. It could, unless the people who are here perhaps see a more long-term future here. They might decide 10 years later, 20 years later, young people who want to migrate might decide that, well, Brazil gives a citizenship. Korea is a richer country, but I can become a citizen of Brazil or Canada, or, you know, these different countries offer a way to put down roots. That might be what's going on. And then, so that's related to the next one is, will more people put down roots in Korea? And therefore, what does putting down roots in Korea mean? That means an investment in learning Korean. And that's where you get, you know, how immigrants view the investment in learning that language. If you're here for 3 years, you know, why learn much Korean? So you'll just kind of get by and then go. And that creates a more temporary attitude towards learning the language. But if you want to put down roots here, then that means more people will learn Korean more seriously. You'll have a next generation, et cetera, et cetera. And over time, that will influence the Korean language. Just as what's happened with the, you know, migration I talked about with to Rhode Island, the Quebecois, the Irish, and the Italians migrating to Rhode Island, that ended up influencing the English used in Rhode Island. But for that to happen in Korea, the foreigners who are here have to find a way to stay, or otherwise you'll have a cycling in and cycling out, and the impact on Korean language will be not so much. So I'll leave you with that thought. And next slide, please. And this is baklava that I had in Gimhae, and I just come back from a trip to Turkey. And there was this Turkish restaurant, and I said, they don't have baklava, but I'm going to try. I walk in, yeah, this is, you know, and I was able to get this gorgeous baklava and Turkish tea, and was happy for the rest of the day. It was a treasure. So thank you very much. Well, any questions? Okay, yes, in the back. Yeah, and then oh, well, thank you. You know. I mean, for preparing I guess researching it from a more serious point of view, I've done it I did a little bit in 2008 and, 2008, 9, 10, 11, and then more recently last year and this year. So recently, it's just that last year and this year. Yes. Okay, next question. Right. Right. That's a great question, because there's some school of thought that, says, well, if there are so many languages, maybe just put Korean and leave it at that. I didn't see any of that was aimed at foreigners or the migrant community. There were obviously signs that are aimed at everybody, like Juchagumji, that one sign in the restaurant. So there are signs that are a lot of the road signs and things are totally new. They're only in Korean, and you assume that they're aimed at everybody. And so but yes, that's an interesting point, and it goes back to the question of who decides. If you have a bunch of languages, like the example from Gimhae, where you had Korean, English, Chinese, Vietnamese, but there are many more other groups there. Why were those groups left out? It could be something as simple as they don't have the font, or they don't have somebody to check it. Okay, so, and that sounds like a laughing story, but actually in New York Chinatown in the 1960s, they made a lot of street signs in Chinese, and a lot of them have unfortunately disappeared. And some people want to keep them as historic relics now, but they were hand painted. So they found people in the Chinese community in New York to actually hand paint the Chinese signs and then put them up, because there was no font or printing of Chinese signs in America in the 1960s. So it could be something like that, or it could be, well, we'll just take the more dominant groups, the larger number by population. Yeah.
I'm very interested to know the official sign, the official sign policy. I wonder if they have a kind of a special guidelines or official, policy as far as the sign is concerned in the state, depending on the state.
In Korea or the United States?
In the state.
Ah.
I think it's really important because, we have more than 2 billion foreigners living in Korea. Of course, half million on both the undocumented workers. That's very important to let them know. Okay?
Right, right.
They might work in the state in Canada. I think we have, Canadian friend. Yeah, I travel up many times there, but it's officially Korean.
Ah, yes, yes.
But everywhere, English friend. I really enjoy the sign.
Ah, okay, yes, yeah. Yeah.
So what about in the state? Of course, I used to live there many years, but if you go to Florida, there was a restaurant everywhere, Spanish.
Right.
Right?
Well, okay, to answer your question, yeah.
The policy guideline?
There's no guideline in the United States about language. And Korea actually is interesting because the only official language in Korea is Korean. So So in Korea, the situation would be that the road signs are under the administration of that, you know, what is it? That part of the ministry of the government. So all the road signs in Korea are standardized, but not all of them. For example, if you go to Sokcho, there are road signs in Russian. Busan. So local governments can add a language if they want to in Korea. So the standard would be English and Romanization, or Korean and then Romanization, but there you will find other examples as well. So, and as far as the United States, I can't answer that question because I don't know, but there's no national official language in the United States, which is different from Canada. Some states have English only as their official language. I think 31 states, 31 of the 50 states have English only, but that would not affect a lot of the roads and things or what local governments could do. So other question, yeah?
So I noticed you were in the slide where you were noting how the migrant population has been decreasing, that it was very prevalent during the pandemic.
Yes.
So I thought you said that's partly because of development, but I think also partly because of the pandemic. So how much of that do you think is because of the pandemic and so likely to reverse itself versus development, which might not reverse?
Right. I don't know. I'm kind of leaving you with that question, but I think it's actually both, to be honest, because I've talked to some people in the university world who, you know, are saying their university is running out of students or things like that, and that the Chinese students are not coming back as much. So the pandemic may have caused a lot of students to leave. Certainly Japan, it was a disaster for foreign students, you know, and some foreign students in Japan actually came to Korea, right? So, you know, there was that, a lot of shocking things that happened. I think it might not recover, you know, foreign students and things like that might not recover to pre-pandemic levels simply because they're not coming in as large numbers. That's just my guess, but we'll have to wait and see. It's kind of an interesting question.
So don't ask why, but I've been to a lot of construction sites.
I won't ask why.
But generally when I see construction, like science, safety signs and stuff like that, that I haven't seen before, I photograph them.
Mhm.
And I've noticed over the last at least 5 years, a lot more languages appearing on them. that
Great,
weren't
thank you for
there
adding that.
before.
Yes, yes.
So I'm thinking maybe you might want to take a look at that.
Sure. Yeah, keep your photographs and maybe we can work on a paper together. Co-author a paper. I mean, okay. Yeah, Dunbar starts with a D and Fouser starts with an F, so you go first. But if I do more of the writing, no, I'm just joking. But yeah, I mean, it's a way of, that's exactly right. And that confirms what my architect friend said. I mean, she said, without foreigners, you could do no construction in Korea. And this meeting was not a heavy meeting. It was, we were meeting for dinner and you know, a friend asked her how much it would cost to remodel her office. And my friend thought it would be 5 million, and the architect friend did all the math and, and about 10 minutes later came up with 20 million. And, you know, my friend was like 20, you know, but it's it's the costs of labor, and there's a parts issue, but the cost of labor, and yeah, that may keep increasing too.
Likely,
Yeah, yeah.
It's drawing my attention to this thing that I'm observing.
You have a great resource. Yeah, yeah. You know, it's interesting. Any other questions? Yeah.
The impact of this ethnic groups as they go back to their mother country.
Oh,
because
wonderful question. Yes.
I actually sometimes purpose speak English to lower the entry, make it more comfortable for the Koreans to speak to me in English. I
Oh,
actually found myself like back home talking to my brothers in England, which is Korean with broken English.
Right.
English with broken Korean,
right.
just for fun. So there's a two-way street here.
Yes. I've not studied that, but when I prepared this, you know, the one slide where I talked about the Dominican community in Rhode Island, I did read a paper, very fascinating paper about how a lot of the kids, not the immigrants, but their offspring who go to schools in Rhode Island, because they are identified as Black, they may not identify that way themselves, but they are identify as Black, they will kind of pick up Black American English and use that, even though that has no roots to their community, because it's convenient for them to fit the role that society assigns them. So there's a kind of, then there's a mixing of English and kind of Black English and then Spanish maybe at home. So that was a paper that did research on that. So what you're talking about is, you're saying, okay, society views me as this way, or I want to kind of fit in, so I'm going to alter my language. And people do that all the time. So that would be a great topic of research, like find Vietnamese who've been to Korea, or find, people who've been to Korea that's a great topic for research. One interesting case like that is also the Turkish Gastarbeiter who went to Germany and returned. So there's, some research on the use of German in Turkey among Turkish people with a German experience. It happened to me twice in Turkey. I went in and somebody spoke German to me, and because they thought I was German more than American, whereas in, or English speaker. So in Turkey, sometimes German is a common experience that people have. Yeah.
I lived in
It's
Texas for a
fascinating,
while, and
yeah.
when I say y'all, everywhere they get funny.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. Which is why I don't speak Gyeongsang-do Korean at all. And Kyoto Japanese, I only speak it if I'm really excited or something. So you kind of, you feel there's an expectation about you, and you kind of try to fit in to not stand out in a way. Yeah, it happens all the time. It's a great question. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah.
Which languages have you seen in Japan like this? In Japanese cities, you notice other communities?
I haven't done as much detail in this, but the place where I've noticed a lot is the Nagoya area, because of the auto factories and all the suppliers for Toyota, and there's Suzuki, I think, is in Hamamatsu, which is near Nagoya. So there's a lot of factory towns, and a lot of the people who work in those factory towns are Brazilian Japanese. So if you go to Nagoya, there's a lot of Portuguese. So yes, I've seen a lot of Portuguese, and in that part of Japan, you hear it, a lot of Portuguese in that part of Japan. And Tokyo, of course, there's Shin-Okubo area of Tokyo, which used to be heavily Korean, but now is becoming more Pan-Asian. And what's the reason? Because fewer Koreans are going to Japan. And that, again, kind of touches back on the question of, well, why would a Korean want to go to Japan right now? I mean, as a right, because maybe if you have a specific reason, but the gap between the countries has narrowed. So the image of Japan as this wealthy country that you go to that's changed. So there are fewer Koreans going, and then the number of college students in Korea is less. So there would be fewer Korean students studying in Japan. So Shin-Okubo is kind of becoming more Pan-Asian. But I haven't been to Tokyo in 4 years, but I remember that last visit, because the 2000s, early 2000s, it was mostly Korean, and now it's becoming a little more Pan-Asian. All done, or not? Another question? Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.